Welcome to another edition of Coffee Break with Paolo. I'm Paolo von Schirach, your host. This program is brought to you from the Switch and Board studio in Washington, D.C. Today, we're talking about defense and geopolitics, and we have the right expert to discuss these issues with. Arnold Dupuy is with Booz Allen Hamilton, working on defense energy sector, and also an adjunct at George Mason University and Virginia Tech. Welcome, Arnold.
Thanks, Paolo. Glad to be here.
All right, let's, this is a kind of a big topic, but I thought that for our audience, it may be interesting just to kind of get this step by step. And let's start with the most obvious thing, the defense budget. You are a defense expert. And we know that defense spending in the United States obviously is a significant component of overall spending, of federal spending, but it's never been constant. It's been up and down, and both in absolute terms as well as a percentage of federal spending and as a percentage of GDP. Give us just a general illustration of where are we now and where are we coming from, and also maybe break some myths. Is this a lot of money, a little money, too much money? Is it well spent, badly spent? Let's try to attack all these
Sure.
things.
Right now we're looking at about a $700 billion defense budget, which is roughly 3% of GDP. Compared to the height of the Cold War, which average was between 5 to 6%, sometimes higher, depending on the perceived threat at the time. So in real terms, it's smaller than usual, but it's still $700 billion is a lot of money, so I'm not going to dispute that. Whether it's too much, it depends on who you talk to. Some people will say it is, some people will say it's not enough. I think we do need to enhance our capabilities, defense capabilities, primarily in the area of new weaponry, new assets, new hardware, and this is all very expensive, and this costs money. And in order to stay competitive with our potential adversaries, we do need to have a robust budget to support this.
Yeah. Again, just for the non-expert, let's clarify that all this money goes primarily, please tell us the details, to current operations. I mean, in other words, you've got to keep this vast machinery going. And also we do have an all-volunteer force, which means paying salaries and benefits and all kinds of things. In other words, how much of this money goes to what the experts call procurement, buying stuff? It varies from years to year, but it's not $700 billion, right?
Well, I'm not sure of the exact
breakdown
by types or by function. Paying personnel, their salaries, their benefits, their supporting their families is extremely expensive, and that's where the majority of the money goes to. Also, we have to look at the new hardware. The F-35 is extremely expensive. It's also very capable. So, with new capabilities comes expense. So the new technologies that we're looking at, particularly in naval assets, air assets, space, this is all very expensive. So we need to keep that in mind, that we're not just talking operations, we're not talking necessarily fuels, but we're looking at the whole spectrum of defense expenditures, which is very detailed, very complex, and also, as I keep saying, it's very expensive, and it's important that we stay competitive there.
And so, again, if people have, maybe watched old movies, the World War II and all that, when America was, the factory for the world, for what we call the arsenal of democracy, right? That was the word. And in those days, it was possible to make this stuff like sausages. In other words, you could have a factory spitting out, fighter planes and ships and whatever. It doesn't work that way anymore. This stuff has become very complicated, and as you said, full of electronics and full of gadgetry, and so per unit, it's become very expensive.
That's a great point. If we go back to World War II, in which we had, again, tremendous economies of scale, so we would put out thousands of tanks and aircraft. You had the cost benefit there, and also they were much simpler compared to today. Now we don't have the economies of scale that we did. And again, just the technological components, the involvement that from the different aspects of industry involvement, it's all very much more complex, and then that adds on to the cost. So again, we need to take all this into account when we're talking about a defense budget that we need to address.
And also, it is kind of a usually an understood, how can I say, understood point that America is largely a naval power, right? Because we are surrounded by two oceans, Atlantic and the Pacific, and so the Navy has been traditionally the backbone of our force and our projection force, and the carrier groups, the big aircraft carriers that everybody knows about. They're like little cities, floating and with an airfield, on the deck. But it's kind of stretched, right? I mean, I remember back in the Reagan administration, which is a long time ago, but not centuries ago, we were talking about the 600, Navy ship Navy,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Now we don't even get to 300. Is that a problem as we're trying to address situations that may arise at different parts of the world, that we just don't have enough boats? Is that a problem?
I think it is, and for a variety of reasons. And as you mentioned, that the ability to project power, project influence, is part of what we do in the United States, whether we like it or not. We are a global power, and this is part of the burden of leadership that we have to bear. And we are, again, I'm not exact on the numbers, we are under 300 ships, and we also need to upgrade our capabilities, particularly as we see a dramatic increase in capabilities and size of the Chinese Navy, for instance. So we need to make sure that we're competitive there, and these are all things that has to be addressed. And I think an example of how we're stretched is the last year there were several highly publicized shipping accidents in which
Yes.
I think there was loss of life. That's being attributed to stress on the individuals, over the operational tempo being so high that people were making mistakes, coming down to training issues. So I think
Too many deployments.
So people are exhausted. They're being pushed beyond their capabilities, and I think a lot of this comes down to the need to refocus on the Navy. As you mentioned, was the first line of defense. We've always been a naval power, even if you go back to roughly the War of 1812, and after that, we were always interested in expanding our naval capabilities because our strong positions on the oceans. And I think to some extent that has eroded, and I think there's big emphasis on
again, not to get too technical, but of course, since the backbone of the fleet is the carrier, and the carrier group, that is all the ships that support the aircraft carrier, that defend it, that provide the perimeter, all that kind of technical stuff, which, by the way, it's a nice piece of change, right?
It sure is.
The carrier itself, the complement of airplanes on it, and then all the other vessels that essentially protect the carrier.
Sure.
That's several billions of dollars.
Absolutely, at the height of the Cold War, I think we had 15 or 16 carrier groups. Now we're down to 11. So I think there's a reevaluation of that. Whether we're seeing China develop its own carrier. They have one carrier that they bought from Ukraine, I believe, some years ago.
Time. And then they're making their own round.
They're making their own. So China is very interested in developing its carrier force, its projection of its own, which is certainly within its right to do that. But we need to also keep an eye on that, and whether 11 carrier groups is enough, whether we want to supplement that with other types of platforms that allow projection.
And also, some people are speculating that there are new types of projectiles, so to speak, of missiles or what have you, that can endanger. In other words, the idea was, you can't sink a carrier until, or maybe it's extremely difficult to sink or disable a carrier because it's so big, huge, maybe, I don't know, triple hulls or whatever they've got, and also because of its own active defenses that can neutralize, attacking objects. But now it looks like, we're talking about new generations of weapons, hypersonic, missile, and therefore that the carriers may be vulnerable to an extent that they were not. Is that an issue, considering that that's the backbone of the fleet?
It certainly is, and again, that the Chinese have developed very sophisticated anti-ship missiles, which definitely endanger carriers. The Russians have their own So that creates an issue where we need to maintain a standoff distance further away from, most of these are ground launched, although there are possible ship launched. So we need to keep that into account, whether, so if it may be that instead of 11 carriers, big carriers, we have smaller, more maneuverable carriers that are able to project power but not create such a
big target.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to the obvious next level here. We're talking about our capabilities, more or less. I mean, our costs, and what we're trying to do and stay up to date and develop and adopt new technologies, which, as you indicated, are extremely expensive compared to what they used to be. But let's talk about the threat or threats. In other words, we need this stuff because, of course, we can say, oh, the world is still a dangerous place, etc. Back, I'm sure both of us remember very well, when the Warsaw Pact disappeared, the Berlin Wall went down, and everybody said, hey, hooray, no more Soviet Union. And we were talking about the peace dividend, right? Saying, well, we set up this huge machinery, which is NATO, for the purpose of protecting Europe and creating a North Atlantic defense shield, or at least deterrent against, Soviet encroachments. But with the Soviet Union gone, who needs this stuff anymore? Well, we still have it. Can you tell us, the rationale, the debates, or a little bit of what happened after 1989, 1990, when at least the most visible threat to Western security went away, let's say diminished greatly, and where are we today, and why we still have NATO, in fact, a bigger NATO, oddly enough, than the one we had during the Cold War, and do we see Russia as a threat, the new Russia, the post-Soviet Russia as a threat, and are we doing whatever is necessary to protect ourselves against it?
Yeah, those are some great questions, and I remember very well, as you do, when the wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. Everybody was tempted to declare victory and go home, and certainly we pulled most of our forces out of Germany, for instance, because they weren't needed. I mean, that was obvious, and it was probably a deserved and needed reduction in force. But I think in a lot of cases we took our eye off the ball, and we were diverted by events in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the Balkans. So I think we figured that NATO was not as relevant, and so we allowed a lot of these capabilities to deteriorate to some extent. That has changed. I think we're now seeing Russia. I'm reluctant to say Russia is a threat. They're certainly a competitor. They have acted aggressively, counter to what we would see as normal actions certainly within the Western perspective. So we need to take that seriously too. And I think gradually people are realizing that Russia has not been acting in a way that we see as positive for neighborly relations, and that has prompted higher defense spendings, and certainly among the NATO allies. Again, I think at the Wales summit some years ago that they agreed to the 2% GDP.
But that's not working too well, is it? At least not across the board.
No, and it never has, to be honest with you. I remember seeing statements from the Nixon administration that NATO was not paying its full, not keeping its end of the bargain. So there have been complaints that the NATO allies have not pulled the weight for decades. So this is really.
But do you think it's sort of par for the course, or is that worse than before in terms of the lack of enthusiasm for defense spending?
I think it has gotten worse than before. I think, again, the lack of a clearly identified adversary after 91 forced people to say, well, again, we don't need NATO. My view is we need NATO more than ever, just to have a developed structure, which has had decades to develop and develop these capabilities. It's crazy to throw it away, and Europe and they need this type of a collective security regime. So to answer your question, I think that the percentage of GDP that our allies spend is in some cases woefully inadequate. In some
I mean,
cases,
Germany is a little bit above 1%, isn't that?
Yeah,
Am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct, and that's
And the threshold, I mean, at least the target is what, 2%, which is
2%.
not exactly wow,
yeah,
incredible,
considering we spend 3%, and the fact that Germany has no real plan to get above 2% in the next
Anytime
several
soon.
years, so that has created some concern that the German military is not as effective as it once was in the
But
Cold War.
do you think, all told, that, of course, you said it took decades to build this cooperative infrastructure, the main sort of instrument to coordinate security and defense talks and concerns between the United States and Europe. It's a big deal. It took a long time to put it together,
Sure.
and so it would be a shame to throw it away. But again, if the alliance lacks tools, in other words, that it's kind of then it's a paper alliance. I mean, say, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and if Estonia is attacked, we're going to all jump in and protect Estonia, which is a small country in the Baltic, which used to be part of the old Soviet Union. But if the capabilities are not there, don't we have a problem? I mean, don't we have a real problem?
We do, certainly. But I do see things improving slightly. I mean, I do see some countries are increasing their budgets. There have been a lot more exercises, a lot more. So again, slowly, we're seeing
Improvements. Okay.
Certainly capabilities. I think the big wake-up call was Ukraine and the Crimea in 2014. I think that shook a lot of people up in NATO and realized that Russia is
Bizarre, a little strange.
well, yeah, again, I don't want to say that, but they have different perspective on what we view as sovereignty, and I understand the whole dynamic of their complaints against what they see as violations of sovereignty in Kosovo and so on in Serbia. But we understand that. But I think the Europeans realize that they couldn't really take this lying down, and so they need. So slowly we're seeing every improvement in budget allocation and capabilities and training. So the pendulum is, I see it slowly shifting, maybe not fast enough as we would like to see, but there is improvement.
But if you look at Russia, again, with kind of a sobering view and reflecting on its overall strengths and capabilities, we know that Russia obviously is still a formidable producer of energy. We know that,
Mm-hmm.
an exporter of energy. That's one of its, in fact, I wouldn't say it's only, but its primary, source of earnings. Of course, the defense exports is another one.
Sure.
But if one looks at the overall dynamism of the Russian economy, all told, the energy sector, the defense industries, and other sectors that Russia has, are you inclined to think that it has the staying power, Russia, notwithstanding what they've done, and you mentioned Ukraine, Crimea, and all that, but that it is for the long term really, watch out Russia because these guys are dangerous or getting bigger, stronger, or is this a bit overblown based on the state of their economy and notwithstanding the fact that they've got all the nuclear weapons and blah, blah, blah?
Yeah,
I mean, how do you see it?
Another great question, because we see Russia having significant economic weaknesses from sanctions, from the relative drop in the oil price, which is a significant contributor to their GDP and their defense, and the demographics. But I'm always reluctant to
Write them off.
to write them off because many people have, and it was so, going back to Napoleon and before. So you have to take the Russians seriously. They are a great power, and they have, I think they have a determination to prove that. And keeping in mind that their GDP is roughly the equivalent of Italy. However, they are very capable. Their military is relatively large and fairly professional. They've been professionalizing the military over the last several years, and they're devoting a large portion of their GDP towards defense. So it's we need to take them seriously. We need to recognize that they have weaknesses, which may also contribute to their willingness to go beyond their borders as a means of propping up their domestic popularity. These are all things we need to take into account, realizing that they can be a very dangerous adversary if it comes down to it.
Before we move on to Asia, which I think it's another extremely important theater, and where America has had a traditionally strong influence in what was called the Pacific, and now it's called the Indo-Pacific, and it's modifying the terminology. Let's talk about for a moment about all the other stuff, that is the asymmetric threats, the other things that have been, oddly enough, at least our attempts to counter them have dominated policymakers for many, many years. Of course, where the pivotal event was 9/11, right? And we discovered our vulnerabilities vis-a-vis asymmetric threats, terrorism. Of course, we knew about terrorism before, but we thought of it more like a nuisance, well, maybe more than a nuisance, but not an existential threat. And then we, on account of 9/11, correct me if I'm wrong, we said, oh my God, this is really big. We got to do something really drastic about it. And so we went into Afghanistan. And then we thought that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and he might have nuclear weapons, and he might give a small nuke to some terrorist group. And so we said, this is impossible. We can't live with this with this threat, this cloud. And so we got to take him out. And we went in Afghanistan, Iraq. We spent a fortune.
Sure.
And Iraq, at the end of the day, is now a subsidiary of Iran. Maybe it's a bit too strong a word, but I'm sure you can give us your take. Afghanistan, after 17 years, 18 years, is lost, essentially. We're negotiating our exit with the Taliban controlling right now about half of the country, give or take. So did we get it wrong? I mean, in other words, we had a problem, a real problem, terrorism, and asymmetric warfare, meaning the ability of small actors to inflict a great deal of damage, even to us, the biggest superpower. I mean, do we have a grip on this? Are we doing the right things, or have we learned from our mistakes or lessons?
I think so. You're talking about how we learn a lesson from the counterterrorism focus, or?
And also having deployed these enormous resources in efforts that perhaps were not wise. I mean, we went in Afghanistan to catch bin Laden, which we didn't at the beginning, but then we decided to rebuild the country. That this was really necessary. And considering the level of underdevelopment of Afghanistan, it was mission impossible almost by definition.
I agree, yeah. And having done a tour in Afghanistan and
firsthand.
tried to rebuild them in my own little way, it was and still will be a challenge, just because of the damaged infrastructure after so many years is still not developed. I think we have learned our lesson in a certain respect, in that our latest national defense strategy has shifted from primarily a counterterrorism focus to more of a regional great power focus. So the national defense strategy came out early last year, and that is driving. So we're now looking at a great power.
So this is kind of the roadmap for our defense,
yes, so
our security establishment.
Right, so
this is what we're looking at.
Yeah, so we've shifted from primarily a counterterrorism role, which we had which was part of our strategy for many years. Now we're looking at a broader picture, broader effort on peer adversaries, Russia and China primarily, and Iran to a lesser extent. So I think we have learned our lesson there. Again, the motivations for going into Afghanistan was certainly political as much as military. I mean, we needed to show that we
could react.
We could react, and to demonstrate to the American people that we were trying to do something. And so, and at the beginning,
things went very well. I mean, at the very beginning, right? I mean, we got rid of the Taliban with almost no ground forces. I mean, very little,
Yeah,
very light footprint, right, at the time.
And I was always surprised that when I was there, we had, in 2003 and 2004, there were very, very limited opposition from the Taliban. I say limited in a relative sense. And I attribute that to how badly they were defeated in the first part of the war, because they were unable to recover for several years until gradually they were able to, they had the safe havens in Pakistan. So
Yes.
So they were defeated pretty severely, and we were still unable to maintain that. Over time, the position has eroded to the point where. So now we're. So go ahead.
Yes. So let's say that now we've moved away, as you say, from this counterterrorism focus, even though clearly terrorism is still out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a strange animal because it takes a couple of people
Sure.
to do a lot of that. We've learned that lesson, right? And unfortunately, because of the way our societies are, we react with a lot of,
Sure.
wow, my God, what
Sure.
happened if somebody, and I know this is not funny at all because it's very dramatic if somebody goes in with one machine gun in a shopping mall and shoots and kills 20 people. It's a horrible thing, and anybody, I would say anybody, but it's easy. Unfortunately, it's not an impossible threshold, right? For a small group of people. We've seen this in Europe. We've seen somebody using a truck or and mowing down people in celebrating the National Day in France, right? That was 2-3 years ago. I forgot, but that was just one person on one truck and literally killing I don't know how many people in one evening. So that's, unfortunately, we know that these things exist, and certainly the F-35s and the super carriers won't help you very much to face that level of threat. But nonetheless, we are kind of recalibrating and moving away from that particular focus. But let's talk about something before we go to China and the Pacific and other concerns. Let's talk Iran, because it's so much in the news right now, in particular because of these accidents and even the news today, the Iranians shot down, allegedly, an American drone.
Right.
What's going on there? How do you read the game plan of the administration in ratcheting up pressure on Iran? Of course, we know that we say that the Trump administration at least says the nuclear deal was bad, didn't really address all the issues, and in particular, it did nothing to change behavior, Iran's behavior in the region, away from actions and policies that are clearly detrimental to our interests and the interests of our allies. So what's the policy? What are we trying to do here? How do you view this?
My take is we're trying to pressure the Iranian regime as much as possible, whether the goal is regime change, which is, I think, probably what they want, though I think in some cases be careful what you wish for. But I think there's clearly an attempt to pressure the regime and to.
But to get what? To do what?
I think they're concerned about the threats to Israel, for one thing. It's clearly the Iranian support of Hezbollah and of activities against Israel.
Hezbollah being this militias which are largely based in southern Lebanon, right?
Yeah, the Shia militia / political element that exists in Lebanon, yes. So there's that concern. Also the Iranian support for efforts in Iraq and also Syria. So we see the Iranian attempt to develop its position in the broader Middle East, also in Saudi Arabia and in the Houthis and so on. So we're seeing
Yemen, yeah.
So we're seeing the activities in Yemen. All this is demonstrating, as far as we see it, as a push by Iran to demonstrate influence in the broader Persian Gulf, which puts them against our allies, certainly Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, which are also very, very critical for oil exports.
But so the administration is putting all this economic pressure on Iran, sanctions, oil, embargo on oil deliveries, and all that. But as you say, there could be an objective of seeing that the regime would kind of implode and melt down, or are we trying to convince this regime to come back and negotiate with us something? And what would that something be?
Could be come back to renegotiate the JCPOA and
That's the nuclear treaty, yes?
To basically pull back from any kind of nuclear development. That could be one of the options I'm looking at.
And can we get them to stop malfeasance, so to speak, in the neighborhood? Can we force them to say, okay, no more money to Hezbollah, no more money to the Shia militias in Iraq, no more? Can we do that? Are we in a position to really twist them in such a way that they will say, yes, sir?
I don't think so, unless we want to punish them militarily severely, which opens up a whole new can of worms. I don't think that you're going to get them to stop completely in these types of activities.
Can we exert enough pressure to essentially destroy the Iranian economy, which was not doing great even before the sanctions imposed by Trump? Can there be a point in which they say, hey,
I don't know. I think
no mas, okay, no more.
I think there's still enough buyers out there for their oil and gas that will keep them propped up to maintain basic control for
they can, even with the sanctions?
I would say so.
How do they do that? I mean, through smuggling, through other
surreptitious activity, sure. I mean, they sell it to quite a few countries right out in the open, so in violation of the sanctions. So there's how you make the sanctions airtight. And that's
because I thought that their production and export had declined very significantly.
It has.
But you think there's enough there to keep them alive?
I would think so. I mean, if unless there's a large-scale uprising, which again is always possible, I think they're able to maintain control indefinitely with the.
But so is therefore this policy by Washington then just a show of force, which is not going to yield the results that the administration claims? Is that kind of?
I just don't think so. I think on one hand it's important to again demonstrate that their activities is not, we can't tolerate their activities, but to actually get them to change it permanently, irrevocably is
iffy.
I just think that they have enough revenue coming in that they can maintain.
They can survive.
Yeah.
They can withstand the pressure.
I would think so.
All right.
I would think so.
But that's good to know. Okay, let's move on to the Pacific,
Sure.
which is really kind of a big deal because,
Sure.
of course, the dominant power in Asia, as we know now, it's no longer the Soviet Union, but it's a resurgent China.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take? In other words, we see, again, China has done incredibly well in the last 30 years or so to go from disaster,
Mm-hmm.
which was the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, which essentially destroyed,
Yep, sure did.
among other things, whatever its other objectives, but certainly a byproduct was the destruction of the education system, of the university system, and of the economy. And then we've seen this dramatic turnaround and rise of China as an economic power. Now it's the number 2 economy in the world, poised probably to overtake the United States sometime soon, at least in GDP, not GDP per capita. It's a different story. But now we're beginning to fear all kinds of things, that they are essentially, not playing fair on economic and trade issues, but also that they seem to have unveiled ambitions of hegemony in the region and beyond that before were not discussed. What's your take? How do you see this?
Yeah, I look at this. I always try and put a historical precedent to things. And I think China suffered tremendously during its century of humiliation, as they call it, roughly between the 1850s through
the Opium Wars and all that stuff.
Yeah, so they suffered terribly from outside interventions. They also suffered tremendously from, as you mentioned, internal incompetence from Mao and from their other activities that they did when they tried to consolidate power. But there's no question the Chinese people have suffered tremendously, and I think now they have to they want to demonstrate that they are a great power. And certainly they as for centuries they were the middle kingdom. All the other countries were revolved around China, and so they're very sensitive to that. So I think so when Deng Xiaoping, the premier after Mao, instituted these economic reforms in 1979 into the 80s, as you mentioned, the Chinese economy developed tremendously once they were integrated into the global economy. But with that growth, we've seen a strong military presence and more of an aggressive military presence, certainly in the region. So we're seeing, again, activity in the South China Sea, where they're taking islands which certainly are disputed between Vietnam and the Philippines within their own economic zones.
Spend some time describing this, because I know that for our audience this is kind of a mysterious subject. What's the South China Sea? What are all these rocks? And what is the geopolitical significance of China asserting sovereignty, essentially, and building up these rocks and claiming that the South China Sea is really Chinese, primarily? What's the meaning of all this?
The South China Sea is extremely important because a huge amount of the maritime trade passes through the South China Sea, quite often on its way to Taiwan, to other Chinese cities, also Korea and Japan. So that is one of the most valuable maritime trade routes in the world. With China controlling that trade route, that gives them tremendous freedom of action, tremendous power over what happens there.
And how did this happen? How did, it sort of happened incrementally, right? Almost surreptitiously. What did they actually do?
Within the South China Sea, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of rocks, basically, that are half the time submerged. And so they've gone in, and the Chinese have gone in and, based on a very questionable legal precedent on this, taken over a lot of these islands, and then they've developed them,
They built them up.
And created basically military bases in a lot of respects, to put air bases on them, can put air defense missiles and so on. And then doing so, they've extended their own economic zone because of the law of the sea.
Which means, basically it's kind of clever, right? You have a little rock, and then you have your own, territorial waters around it, and then you got your own exclusive economic zone.
Right.
So you have a little rock, and then you have a perimeter outside of it, which is I don't know how big it is, but it's very significant.
You have the 200 nautical mile exclusive
radius.
Economic zone.
That's a lot. And if you multiply by the number of little rocks,
so
eventually it's all yours.
Of course, this violates the law of the sea, and the UN arbitration board came out against Chinese activity there in support of the Philippines, but that's been ignored. So the idea is China is extending its sovereignty far into
arbitrarily.
Yes.
Without any justifiable legal claim. Because again, just for our audience to understand, because of the strange nature of these rocks, etc., and the fact that there are other countries in the neighborhood, there are multiple claims, sometimes conflicting claims, on the same little pieces of real estate. And the Chinese just came in and said, "Sorry, guys, it's all mine."
Right.
Go home.
So instead of relying on diplomatic activity, diplomacy, which is what would normally be expected in a case like this, the Chinese, because of their sheer power, have gone in there and just basically taken it. And based on this so-called 9-dash line, which is some obscure map that they found that demonstrated 70 years ago that it was Chinese territory. So that being said, there's a tremendous dispute now, and the concern is that a single potentially unfriendly power will be controlling a tremendous sea route.
Our American take, is that we do not recognize that, right?
Correct.
Basically, we dispute this claim, and we try to assert freedom of navigation, right? But through, what is it called, innocent passage?
Innocent passage.
So that we can, we sail in these waters, and every time this happens, the Chinese, you're courting disaster, you're inviting an accident, you'll be sorry, or something like that, right? Right? So this is complicated, and also goes back to what we were discussing at the beginning, that is the amount of assets that we can deploy, and also, as you pointed out earlier, the proliferation of shore batteries, sort of anti-ship missiles, that give the U.S. commanders a bit of a pause in how close do you want to get to the Chinese shores, right? Explain it to us. What does this mean? Are we witnessing a shifting of the balance there in that particular region of the Western Pacific near the Chinese mainland on account of these actions?
I would say yes. I mean, we're clearly seeing China exerting its hard power well into the first line of island defense, the first line of islands, through Taiwan in that regard. So there's clearly an ability of China to exert influence and military power well past its shoreline.
But so beyond complaining, which we do, and not just us. I mean, the Australians do it. Others have voiced their concern. I guess the Japanese too. Although other countries in their neighborhood, so to speak. But short of complaining and saying this is not legal, you don't have a right to do this, and they say, okay, so what are you going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Can we do anything about it? Can we reverse this? Can we force one way or the other through negotiations, diplomacy, or what have you, get the Chinese to say, on second thought, we made a mistake. We're leaving.
I don't see any change in Chinese policy as long as Xi Jinping is in power, in which he's very much a forceful proponent of this.
And he's not going to go anytime soon.
No, he's there for
life,
for as long as he wants. I think the best way is to continue these freedom of navigation movements, which every time we do that, we demonstrate that we don't acknowledge these, and that puts into question the whole concept of the rite of passage and the extension of sovereignty into these. The other thing we need to do is work with the regional states, Vietnam, Philippines, to push back. And the Chinese have been very good at playing the one against the others and doing unilateral agreements. And we need to recognize that China is, as a growing economic force and a growing military force, will have certainly a certain sphere of influence and sphere of control within its border. But that puts it up against some of our strong allies. We have defense agreements with Taiwan, with Japan, and certainly with Korea. So we need to make sure that these issues are also taken into account.
Can we bring India into this fold? I mean, I know it's kind of a tricky question.
That's a great question. I think a lot of people are trying to see India as a counterbalance, and we've actually, I'd say, made a lot of efforts in that direction, going back to probably with the Bush administration and also with the Obama administration to try and cultivate India as a counterbalance to China. Keep in mind that India and China are no real friends. I mean, they fought a short border war in 1962, in which China basically came in and took some disputed territory. They are certainly rivals, economic rivals, and potentially, hopefully never military rivals. But again, I generally believe in that approach. I think India is a strong rising power, certainly in the Indo-Pacific. I think once they begin to back away from a protectionist economic model and become more liberalized economy, they will see increased economic growth, and with that will come influence in their own region, in their own sphere of influence. So I see India as maybe not a close ally, but certainly a
potential partner.
A partner in this.
But so if we had a more robust coalition, so to speak, not necessarily, let's all gang up on China, but something, a united front, which, as you say, goes all the way from South Korea to Japan, and I guess Taiwan. It's kind of complicated.
Sure is.
But certainly Australia, which is kind of removed, but certainly a solid partner, and India, and then maybe, of course, Vietnam has a problem with China as a matter of history, and having been sort of a vassal state historically of China, and being also on the receiving end of this
Sure.
assertion of sovereignty in waters that you know the Vietnamese could have claimed as their own. And then, in other words, if we had this united front, not again as an aggressive posture, but would that give Beijing a pause and say, okay, we kind of try to chew more than we can?
I would think so. I would think so. I mean, again, China has every right to develop its economy, develop its military, and sell its products around the world. I mean, that's
that's
been
fine.
a tremendous benefit to everyone around the world.
We're not disputing that.
But you know, their neighbors are very nervous, and they fear that their sovereignty and their future is
I mean,
under
again,
threat.
without being too self-congratulatory, but we like to say that Pax Americana, the American peace that emerged after World War II, was an attempt not to establish, you know, complete American hegemony or the world, but to create a rules-based system that allowed for the growth and hopefully development and prosperity of other countries,
Sure.
with the benign support of the United States, which patrolled the seas and guaranteed free trade and all that. But we were not out there to conquer the world, something that technically we could have done after World War II. We had the means to do that, not the appetite.
Yeah.
And now we say, wait a minute, the Chinese is not so much that they are developing, which is great, they're growing the economy and more power to them, but they want to, you know, change the rules. Is that a fair
I think it's a fair assessment.
assessment?
And I think I think the Chinese have done extremely well under Pax Americana, so to speak. And I think we do need to maintain the same values that we have over the last 60, 70 years of free trade, respecting sovereignty, and the basic principles that are within the WTO, which China is a member, based on our advocacy. So, as far as getting your earlier question, as far as a united front, we don't want to gang up on China
No.
But there certainly needs to be a pushback in certain areas, and the only way you can do that is to provide some kind of a coherent message, coherent position from those that are certainly in fear for their sovereignty and their future.
So if we kind of try to put all this together, and we covered a lot of ground, of course, from Europe to the Taliban to the South China Sea, but are you optimistic? I mean, let's look at the United States and its overall strength and abilities, and strengths and weaknesses economically, which we haven't really addressed a lot, but we have this big defense budget. Again, not particularly big by historic standards, as we discussed. And then we've got these system of alliances. We still have a NATO. We have privileged relationships with Japan and South Korea and other places. We're trying to do all kinds of things.
Sure.
Reassure Europe, reassure the Asian allies, work with the Middle East and Israel and Saudi Arabia and whatnot, contain Iran. Are we doing? Are we doing okay? Are you going forward, given our relative, strengths and resources and abilities and technology, and still, development of new military technologies? Are we doing okay? I mean, are we well poised to maintain a reasonable level of international order that is favorable to our own national interest and to those of the Western world and the civilized world? Or are we losing ground, or there's really, how do you see that? I know it's difficult, but just to, as concluding remarks, what would you say?
I'm generally optimistic. I think things are shifting more. People are becoming aware of the various economic threats. We haven't discussed cyber and hybrid warfare, which is a whole tremendous discussion in itself. But
let's discuss that. That's important. Because that's really tricky, right?
It is.
Because that's really outside the known parameters, and you're not, your nuclear weapons are not going to help you very much to deter cyber attacks or an attack against the electric grid. Or how well are we doing on that front? Because that's really tricky stuff.
It is. Well, again, We could always be doing better, I think, in my view. I think we have some very dedicated people, very, very smart people that are addressing this. The fact that we are devoting more and more of our attention, i.e. budget, political capital, and so on, into the cyber realm, is also encouraging. So I think we're finally realizing that this is potentially a pretty serious threat, not just from the information technology, where you're looking at secrets being stolen, but also from the operational technology, which is actually going in and attacking, grids, weapon systems, where you actually physically damage,
disable
an asset. So we have the potentials there for tremendous damage. I think we're now looking at new technologies, new policies that are giving us strength to, instead of relying on purely a defensive cyber posture, again, more of a offensive, defensive.
Because again, just for everybody to understand, clearly everybody heard about hacking here, hacking there, stuff being stolen, databases being pilfered and what have you. But what we're really talking about is, talking about the United States, is an enormously target-rich country, right?
Sure.
Because we've got thousands of entities that rely on complex systems that are, in principle, at least hackable, and disabling them. Imagine, you can say, whoa, what can happen there? Well, imagine if they indeed manage to disable some attackers, the electric grid, we're done. I mean, if we don't have electricity for a few days,
Absolutely.
we're done. I mean, we're toast. That means a disaster that is, we think 9/11 as a bad thing. Of course it was. Destruction of buildings, thousands of people dead, disruption, confusion, chaos. But no, it's very difficult for the average person to fathom what it would mean to be for several days the nation in the dark, that nothing works.
Sure.
Electricity doesn't work, your refrigerator doesn't work, your elevators don't work, the signals of everything don't work, airports don't work, railways don't work, factories don't work. It would be chaos, a disaster. There's no food, doesn't get to the, just a few days, right? Not weeks or months. And this is not a threat that we can say, oh, that's not going to happen. It may happen.
Well,
I mean, it's unlikely, maybe, but possible, right?
Well, we've seen it happen in Ukraine. In December of 2015, I believe, was they call it the Black Cyber Attack, when a Ukrainian grid was basically brought down. It impacted about 200,000 people off and on for several days, if I'm not mistaken. So it can be done.
Yeah.
It has been done successfully.
And so you're saying that you're comforted by the fact that we are putting more resources and more
Generally, yes. I think we are.
More technology to counter all this?
For better or for worse, we have seen, Russia is using its near abroad, as they call it, as a test bed or guinea pig for their activities, and we're learning a lot. And we're,
about their capabilities.
About their capabilities and how to respond to them. So we're also looking at countermeasures and mitigation efforts. Doesn't mean, again, it doesn't mean that we're not vulnerable, but I do see the fact that we're addressing this. We're putting funding towards these defenses, towards this.
The tricky part, obviously, you've got to get the private sector involved. This is not just a national security operation led by the Pentagon or whatever the dedicated agencies could be, right? You have to have the private sector
Private sector
involved.
is a critical component, especially in an open society that we have here, in which it's much more vulnerable because we don't have the central controls that you may see in some countries. And the private sector is critical to this, just because they own the infrastructure. We depend on it for day-to-day activities, as you mentioned earlier. Plus, the private sector is the leader in some of these mitigation efforts, the new technologies. A lot of it in conjunction with the government, with academia. So in order to really address this, we need to bring in the triad, as I call it, the government/military, academia, and also the private sector to really develop this.
And from your standpoint, as an analyst and as an expert, you reasonably confident that we're making sort of the right moves, that we're making progress, or are we, or there's lack of awareness? Or, how do you view this? I know it's a big thing, so it varies
I mean,
from sector to sector.
People may disagree with me, but I think there's always room for making people more aware. I think that the ability to do that is been somewhat successful. I think now we're getting more attention from leaders on the Hill, for instance, of the threats, not just from information technology, but from operational technology. And I like, from what I've seen, again, I am seeing a shift in resources, a shift in mindset, that this is serious. It's not just a nuisance. This can actually impact people's lives negatively, certainly. It can impact military missions. You can't get fuel to that's the things that I look at on a daily basis. How do you get, if there's a threat to fuel distribution, a threat to rail distribution, how is that going to impact the ability for forces to conduct their missions?
Of course, yeah.
So we
no juice, no.
Yeah. So again, I mean,
no work.
It's a concern, but I do see that gradually we're addressing it. Saying that we won't be vulnerable is going to be incorrect, because we'll all be vulnerable to some extent.
To something, yes.
Yeah, so I think the big question is, how do we respond? How do we identify? Attribution is another huge issue. Who's doing it? Who did this to us? And that's very difficult to
fathom,
to determine, because of ways of disguising yourself and so on. So there's all these things that need to be looked at. But we are, I think, asking the right questions and generally looking at the right right approach.
All right. Well, on that note, which is let's say guardedly optimistic.
Guardedly optimistic, yes.
So we've been around the world a couple of times, sure. And we really thank you, Arnold, for being with us today.
It's my pleasure.
And shedding light on complicated issues. And I'm sure there'll be food for thought, and we would love to have you again. Thank you.
It's great. Appreciate it. Thank you.